Hey there, fellow artists, and welcome to episode 10 of TED Talks Art. In this one, I've decided to go back in time a little bit, about 17 years, in my first foray into the video game industry. And that was for a little game called Cel Damage, which was a toon-shaded vehicular combat racer. And it kind of mimicked Looney Tunes or Warner Brothers sort of art style as well as physics. So a lot of squash and stretch and giant hammers and all that sort of thing. And it was developed by a studio called Pseudo Interactive in Toronto, here in Toronto. That's where I'm based. And it no longer exists, but it had its good run. And it originally, I guess, was formed by three friends who were computer science students. Dave Wu, Rich Hilmer, and Dan Posner. And they did a little tech demo that caught the attention of Microsoft. And eventually it led to a deal to basically develop a game for them for this brand new console that they were creating called the Xbox. So this is pretty much, going back in time. I guess this is the first generation of what became known as next generation consoles, right? And it caught a lot of wind and attention because up until that time, it's pretty much Nintendo and maybe even Dreamcast or Sega. But here we have an American company that's known for PC decided to enter the console market. And so it was an exciting time, and it was also a nerve-wracking time because not only was this the first game that Pseudo ever developed, they were also chosen to be a launch title. And, there's some pros and cons to that. Launch title for the Xbox console. So what are the benefits of that? Well, you get a lot more exposure because everyone's waiting, clamoring for this new system to come out. And usually there's not a lot of games available, so people are kind of desperate to try anything. And this goes back into the Blockbuster days where you'd rent games and things like that. And so that was a good advantage for us since we were an unknown studio and we had no experience and never published anything before. Most of us had never worked on a video game at all. And so that was a good opportunity. Now, the downside of that is because it's a launch title, there's all this pressure to deliver because it's helping to generate sales for the console. At least that's the theory. And on top of that, the deadline, I would say, is even more inflexible because it's so crucial if you're designated as a launch title to make sure you release on time. That's why a lot of other games, you've noticed, if they coincide the release with some other big thing, usually movie adaptations of games. Sorry, not movie adaptation of games, rather, but the other way around. Game adaptations of movies. It doesn't really go that well historically. In most cases, before something like Arkham Asylum came out, superhero video games had a bad name. Why is that? Because they'd release a bunch of huge IPs made by large studios, for the most part, yet delivered craptastic games. Why? Because they are forced to release at the same time as the movies. And the development cycle for a movie and the dev cycle for a game is completely different. It's their only, the only thing they share is the name. The Thor official game or X-Men official game. And usually because of that, they're waiting on a lot of other things and decisions and resources that they don't have enough time to produce a polished game. This is a similar kind of pressure if you're a launch title for a system, which is what we were. So when they got the go-ahead, that's when they were, paid enough to now start hiring people. And that's where I came in, and I was hired in early 2000. And I'd never done concept art before. That term was still pretty new, I would say. And my only experience was I had done a little less than a year of cleanup art at a 2D animation studio in Vancouver. And I've mentioned before that my background was, I went to an illustration program, didn't complete it, only did 2 out of 3 years. And my first work experience was being a cleanup artist, which is essentially a glorified tracer. Someone else who had the experience and the skill did the rough animations and storyboards. And they go, "Here, Ted, make it pretty." And I go, "Yes, sir." And I would go over other people's drawings with cleaner lines. it's not the most creative job. It paid peanuts, but I was just so excited because I couldn't believe I was actually, quote unquote, getting paid to draw. Little did I know that decision would directly impact my future as an artist and my introduction to game development and introduction to even what a concept artist was. That was enough, aside, of course, from the interview and a drawing test. Actually, that drawing test was kind of nerve-wracking because I'd never done one before. I came in, and after the interview, they had me go into a room, or it might have been the other way around, I don't remember. That would make more sense, actually, because if I didn't deliver, then there wouldn't be any point of an interview. So I had no idea what the expectations were, like how many designs I should have completed. I don't even remember how long it was. Maybe it was anywhere between 2 hours and 3 hours. I'm not sure. And they just give me a bunch of descriptions of characters and art style, and I didn't get any chance to see it beforehand. And I just sketched and designed like crazy. All I remember is I'd done so much that my wrist and my hand was aching because I was drawing so fast and furiously. But fortunately it worked out. They liked what I did. I remember the art director coming in, Gary Snyder, saying, "Wow, you're fast." So I thought, okay, that's a good sign. And then I got hired. So there wasn't any other concept artist. I was the only one out of the 15 people in the studio. And however, when I came aboard, it was not called Cel Damage, it was called Cartoon Mayhem. And why is that? It's because since we were designated as a launch title, we were third party to a Microsoft IP. So this was an IP, an intellectual property owned by Microsoft Studios, just like, Halo is or what have you. And so even before I got there, the main characters and the main cars and the general look and feel of the whole world of that game was already established. And that was established by Lane Reichert, who is a veteran in games and animation. Even at that point, I want to say he already had 10 years experience. I believe he was also an understudy of Tex Avery. So if you've ever watched the old school, really awesome Tom and Jerry cartoons, that was Tex Avery. Tex Avery and the Chuck Jones Tom and Jerry's are the best. So what had happened was Microsoft had hired Lane as a third-party consultant on the art side, and they also hired Jordan Wiseman. So if those of you who are fans of Shadowrun or HeroClix, Mage Knight, he was the creator of Shadowrun and the most recent Shadowrun Returns. So Microsoft hired these two third-party consultants who lived in different cities in the States to guide us, Pseudo Interactive. Why is that? Well, it makes sense. First of all, Microsoft took a chance on this small Toronto studio that's never made a game and going on a limb for us, and on top of that, being a launch title. So it's understandable that they would want to ensure that we got some guidance. So that's why they hired Jordan and Lane. So when I got on board, as I mentioned earlier, the cars and the vehicles and the main style was already established. And what would happen is Lane and Jordan would periodically visit Toronto, and I would have my time, especially with Lane, to just kind of draw, design, and shoot ideas back and forth. So I recall very vividly coming in very early on in my job there, and being introduced to these two guys, and being sent off into the conference room with Lane, and I was both excited and terrified because it's like, oh, this experienced artist and just me, and who am I? And I remember he was drawing something, and all I could think in my head is he was so fast and the drawing was so amazing. And he shows it to me, and I start laughing because it's a hilarious joke or hilarious idea that he came up with, and that inspires me. And I sheepishly try to draw, and in my head I'm thinking, this drawing is terrible, it's taking me forever, I'm trying not to erase, but I have to because I'm making mistakes. And after what seemed like an eternity, I show him my drawing, and Lane starts laughing, and my first reaction is, oh no, it's terrible. But then I was like, no, that can't be it, he's not like that. And then he quickly adds that, oh, that's a great idea, Ted, and that gives me an idea. And he is a perfect example of most professionals that I know, where the artists that we really respect and what they do, and they're so good at it, is we all have sort of the same mindset. We're all kind of kindred spirits in the sense that we love and pursue art and passionate about it, and our desire to continue to grow can help keep any kind of ego or pride in check. And Lane was no different. So that was a great experience. So fast forward about, I want to say 3 to 5 months at least, and things are going well. And, after Christmas vacation, I come back, and the project manager, Kevin Barrett, comes out and says, Ted, hope you had a good Christmas. Once you get settled, we need to talk. I have some good news and bad news. I'm like, oh no, I'm fired. No, I'm thinking, I'm doing pretty well. There must be something else, but I wonder what it is. So he comes back and he asks me, what do you want to know first, the good or the bad? And I said, give me the bad. And he says, the bad news is Microsoft has dropped us. I'm like, what? What does that mean? Are we no longer doing this game? Do I no longer have a job? What's going to happen? And so he says, but the good news is we're still going to make the game. So maybe I'm going ahead of myself. Why did they drop us? Long story short, we weren't delivering enough progress in about 8 or 9 month period. And that's because the engine that we're doing had really never been done before, and it was challenging, and it was proprietary. Dave Wu predominantly is the one behind it. And that's what got us the gig, but also presents its challenges. And because we didn't deliver after a long period, Microsoft got nervous. And that's also understandable, because at the end of the day, this is a business. Yeah, it's creative, it's inspiring, but it's still a business. So they got cold feet and they dropped us. Now, that being said, I was told, but we're still going to make this game. I'm like, okay, great. And he goes, but the other good news, Ted, is, actually, let me backtrack. He says, but the bad news also, I go, there's more. He goes, yeah, is that everything that you worked on with Lane, everything that Lane did before you were hired, we cannot use because it's Microsoft's IP. It belongs to them. Cartoon Mayhem belongs to them. So we can't keep any of it. I was like, oh man, ouch. But the good news is, Ted, now you are a guy. You are our man. You get to design everything, including the main characters and the cars and everything else in the world. Okay, that's pretty exciting. The bad news is, because there's no more money coming in, we can't change the deadline. We can't change the launch date. We're still gunning for launch. So basically, the 5 months of work that you did with Lane, the 3 to 4 months of pre-production that Lane had, we can't get that back. So you have to do all this in 2 weeks. What? Okay, so you're telling me, little old me who has no experience designing, was never taught to design, I was only taught to draw, I have only 2 weeks to come up with new characters and cars. No big deal. Yeah, so I'm freaking out, but here's the thing. Do I have any time to be worried or to complain? Nope, because there's no time for that. You guys gotta suck it up and get to the job and work at it. And that was my first foray. And it was very daunting. I was a deer in headlights. But on the flip side, I had learned so much, and I gained so much in my skill set. One thing I quickly realized is, even though we lost everything that Lane had done, they couldn't take away my experience with him. So I remember certain rules that he taught me. Things like, for example, the wet cardboard box rule, to give that kind of distorted or wonky shape to buildings that Looney Tunes and those kind of cartoons had. So that's one example, and that's still stuck with me today. And so I took all of that as well. Probably most important of all is we were all of the same mind in the studio. Regardless of all our situations, we all stayed on. We were determined. We believed in each other. We had high motivation, and that's a huge boost in morale and team unity. And that's probably the thing that carried us through from beginning to end, and arguably even the rest of the history of the company for the most part. So goodbye Cartoon Mayhem, hello Cel Damage, right? So the fact that we were dropped by Microsoft, the fact that we now have less time and we have to in some ways start from scratch, that was a huge drawback, right? That was a huge hit. But that same thing kind of spurred us on, and that allowed us to turn that crisis into an opportunity. Now, we lacked a lot of experience. As I said, none of us had any game dev experience, but what we made up for was definitely passion and hard work. That being said, if you don't have experience, mistakes are made along the way. We did make mistakes, such as assets getting hundreds and thousands of assets getting overwritten accidentally, a texture artist who was totally overworked and had to redo textures multiple times, not because of any fault of their own, but because of changing situations and decisions. I remember doing some crunch, and it was hard. That was back in a time when crunch was kind of just understood to always happen on a more common and often basis until the whole EA spouse situation came. I'm not going to talk about that. Look it up. EA spouse involves a huge class action lawsuit with EA, and it changed our perspective on crunch, yada, yada, yada. But yeah, it was tough sometimes. I would have to kind of time when the last subway and the last bus was, because I lived on the other side of town, and the studio was downtown. And there were a couple times I missed the bus. I caught the last subway, but I would have to take the taxi home, and this is like around 1:30, 2 a.m., whatever. But it paid off in the end, Now, there's some pros and cons to the fact that we had our own IP. Well, it's the biggest benefit. It's our own baby. It's our own idea. No one can tell us what to do, and that's creatively satisfying. What is the drawbacks? Because it's not a known IP, we don't have a fan base. On top of that, we're an unknown studio. So we decided to make the game even before having a publisher. So if you just hear that, you're like, oh, you guys are crazy. How could you make a game and not have a publisher? Well, it's exactly because of those other reasons I said. We didn't have a known IP. Like if you're an unknown studio and then someone gives you Justice League, DC or Warner gives you Justice League, that's a huge boost. All of a sudden you become known because of that IP. But of course the flip side is all this pressure and expectation to do a good job. We didn't have that, but because of that we had more to prove. And to make matters worse, we were a Microsoft third-party studio that got dropped by them. Right? That's ineffectively saying like you're going for a job and the last thing on your resume was a job that you got fired from. That doesn't look too good in the potential employer's viewpoint. In fact, it makes them nervous. So we had all these against us. So the fact that it's an unknown IP in a genre that's not very popular and still isn't today. I mean, count how many combat racers are out there. Racing games, sure, but combat racers, not so much. And on top of that, being dropped by Microsoft. So it was a huge gamble. And what happened? Well, fortunately, it worked out. We finished the game, and it was arguably the harder part wasn't making the game. It was waiting to see if we were going to get a publisher. Because it's not like we just made the game and then decided to look for a publisher. We were looking for a long time, multiple publishers, and it was nerve-wracking just waiting because everything's done. It's like I compare it to, let's say I had to go in for a medical exam or a CT scan or something, or you have a huge exam at university. Yeah, that's stressful, but what's more stressful, you could argue, is that once it's done, having to wait a long period, weeks or whatever, for the results. Did I pass? Did I fail? I don't know. I'm just sitting here waiting. That's what it felt like. But fortunately, just when we're almost at the end of the rope and the money is running out, EA came a calling and they said, okay, we'll take your game. Why? Because what risk was reduced was the fact that we actually finished it. So that could have gone either way. If we didn't get a publisher, that would have been it, and that probably would have been my short stint in video games. I think I would have still been doing art, but not necessarily in video games. So some other things to kind of consider here. Well, I think the other big thing for me was because I was the only concept artist, and pretty common with smaller studios is a lot of multitasking. So given that I've never done this before, the flip side was because I had to do everything, I learned so much. So I did the main characters, the main cars, the weapons, side characters, bosses, the environments, the broad stroke looks of the environments, as well as individual props and designs for buildings. This is also included doing quick animations or animation tests for the modelers, or the animators rather, for the actions such as the movement of the axe or the hammer or whatever on the car. It also included coming up with different gags, tricks that would appear in the levels. I also had to do the user interface, not only the designs themselves of the main menu system and the HUD and all that, but the actual final assets. Usually concept artists do not make final assets, right? You do the designs and they get passed on to someone else, especially if it's 3D to make into a model. Even if it's 2D, it usually gets passed on to somebody else to do the 2D assets. But in this case, I not only had to design the UI, but I made the final assets in the UI because they were 2D. This also included promotional art. I did a cover for a game developer magazine. We had to do little extra things for marketing and that sort of thing. This on top of trying to just make the game. So typically a concept artist is in the design stage, and then it peters off, and a lot of times you move on to the next project while everyone else is working on the current one. In my case on Cel Damage, I was pretty much working through the whole development cycle because I was involved in so much of the design as well as final assets. And as a result, because I was thrust into it and I was a deer in headlights, but I had learned so much, and that just kind of added fuel to the fire. Even something like Photoshop was brand new to me. I was predominantly drawing with pencil, like old school blue and red pencil, and I would have to allot a certain amount of time at the end of the day, at least an hour, often longer than that, just to scan my drawings in. Why? So they have them on record, and so then I could send them to my art director, right? So these are some of the things I had to consider back then. But yeah, it was at the end of the day, it was a great experience. It got me quickly into the world of game development and concept art. And, the question I asked is, would you do anything different? And no, because the way to look at any situation, especially as an artist, is given the circumstances, like limited time, limited skill set, whatever, are you pleased with the results? Yes, I am pleased with it. And that's the most important thing. Yeah, if I had more time, a different situation, would the designs have been better? Yeah, probably. But considering the short window I had, it did, we pulled it off. And I do kind of look back at it with this kind of nostalgic pride. But, it's always fun to move forward. And so as you see throughout this video, I've just decided to update both the character Violet and her APC. On a side note, Violet was originally called Scully. That's the name I came up with, Skully. But just to be on the safe side, we didn't use it because it sounded like another character named Scully, who was part of a famous sci-fi series called X-Files. Well, I don't know. It's spelled differently. I think it would have been cool. But how did it come up with Violet? Well, because I colored her that color. And they said, okay, let's just call her Violet. So it's kind of funny how these things occur. Sometimes there's all this thought put into it. And sometimes it's, simple as, we can't use that name. Come up with something. Okay, how about Violet? Okay, good, let's use it. And that's the nature of it. It's funny because, yes, there's a lot of planning, but sometimes things just happen on the fly. Either designs themselves or names or ideas. And that's part of the joys and pains of this business. So I think that's pretty much it. A little bit of insight on what was behind the scenes in making the game Cel Damage. It was resurrected for a sequel. It was bigger and better in every way, but we didn't do it. Why didn't we do it? Well, simply because we weren't a huge hit, right? It's an unknown IP. A lot of these huge franchises sell millions within hours. We didn't even sell 1 million. We didn't even sell 500,000. We sold 400,000, but not in a day, not in a month. But it took about 4 or 5 years. I remember the project manager coming in, and at that point we were already working on full auto, and the company has grown. At its peak, it was 65, and now is the lead concept artist of my department. And Kevin comes in and goes, guess what, guys? We sold our last unit of Cel Damage. And we were outnumbered by people who never worked on that game. And so the few of us were there, we just kind of sheepishly clapped. And I think I even said, what's Cel Damage? And we just all kind of laughed. But it is what it is. And, it's part of, again, the nature of business. So for the video, though, here, I decided to update Violet and her APC. And that's probably the first time I've ever drawn her in, at least a decade. Cel Damage did come back. There's an HD version on Sony that came out in 2014. And it's ironic because I had nothing to do with that, right? It's the same game. They just updated the graphics and the textures and tweaked the AI, but I still get credit for it on the listings and the credits of the game because I made it back then. So it's pretty funny how things change and circumstances. But this was a kind of fun trip down memory lane. I tell this story to my students in one of my classes, a little more expanded, of course, because I talk about a few other things. But yeah, that's what it was like in a nutshell. That's how it was making Cel Damage. Maybe some of my memory and facts are slightly off, but that's how I remember it. And more specifically, coming from the point of view as a concept artist who was brand new to the job, brand new to the industry, first project. And it was a big, swift kick in the pants, but it helped me to learn. I learned so much, and it really jumpstarted my career and kind of affirmed and confirmed my desire to become an artist. So I think that's it. I think that's all I want to say about it. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned a little something. And there's certain things that have never changed despite technology and industry, right? Games have boomed. We have video game programs now, and I teach in those at school. But what does not change? The passionate pursuit of creative people, right? The passionate artist that loves what they do, pursues it to a fault, sacrifices a lot of things for blood, sweat, and tears to get where they want to be. Not just, of course, to make a living and get some, a resume to back it, but above all those things, it's because of the authentic, sincere, creative pursuit and passion for the art. So I think that's it. Hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, take care.